Hello, everybody. So, this lecture is going to go over the American Revolution. It's going to talk about some things that we discussed in class, but it's also going to give some more information on how the colonists came together and officially declared independence from England. So, let's jump right in. Remember to take really good notes. You don't have to write everything down word for word. Again, these are your notes, but this slide right here has a lot of words on it. You guys know that my other slides are not like this, but I thought this did a really good job at kind of summarizing the whole American Revolution. And again, you can find so many videos online, so if there's a better video online that you like, use that. But I think this is a really good summary. So listen to it first and then maybe pause the video and write down whatever you'd like to write down. So starting at the top in bold, the American Revolution was the fight for independence of the 13 colonies from Great Britain. The Revolutionary War was fought on American soil from 1775 to 1783. But there were many factors that led to the American colonists to seek their independence. In brief, these reasons included: number one, the development of an American identity and culture separate from that of Great Britain. We've kind of talked about this, that the English colonists have been sent over here from England, but you guys know that as they've been colonies, they've been kind of developing their own identity. They've been developing their own culture. We talked about New England culture, middle colonies, southern colonies. Now that time has passed, now that over 100 years has passed, the colonies are definitely viewing themselves as having their own unique identity apart from England. England is all the way across the ocean. Some people, again, are now being born in the Americas. So they definitely have a new identity and a new culture that isn't built from England. So that is huge. That's one of the reasons why the colonists are going to declare independence, because this growing American identity has been happening. Second point, a sense of independence that grew from life on a frontier. So these people some of them came from England, immigrated to the Americas to be independent. And now that the colonies are continuing to develop, there is this sense of, I want to be able to do whatever I want to do. They want to expand, they want to grow, and they don't want somebody to control them. So the colonies are definitely gaining this idea of independence. That kind of leads to the third point, resentment over the end of salutary neglect and the implementation of more strict colonial control, especially new taxes that were levied without the colonists' consent via direct representation in Parliament. So this point is hitting to a big, big issue. You guys remember us talking about salutary neglect, that England kind of, again, quote unquote, forgot about the colonies. They knew they were there, but they weren't imposing a lot of rules. They weren't imposing a lot of laws. There definitely weren't a lot of taxes. But that period of time has ended. Salutary neglect is over, and England is definitely asserting more control. You guys know that the French and Indian War caused England to go into debt. So England is definitely taxing the colonies without their permission, and the colonies are getting really angry. So that's another huge reason why they want to declare independence, because this third point right here. And lastly, what's kind of in the whole background of all of this is the influence of the Enlightenment, especially those ideas from John Locke. We already talked about how the Enlightenment affected colonial governments. Well, the Enlightenment is also affecting just how they think about England in general. The Enlightenment is going to be a huge piece to the Declaration of Independence. It's going to be a huge piece to the Constitution. These ideas of natural rights, consent of the governed, and the ability of the people to abolish or alter an unjust government. All of these are Enlightenment ideas that they're kind of stealing from other thinkers, and it's kind of invading their thoughts and it's influencing their thoughts, and they're thinking maybe we can actually separate from England. So at the bottom, all of this led to increased tensions, culminating in protests and eventually a violent revolutionary war. Fighting first began at the Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775, and the following year, the colonists issued the Declaration of Independence. This whole summary is from Magoosh, kind of a funny name, but it's a really good study site. Again, there are so many study sites for AP US history. Again, just type in APUSH Review or APUSH American Revolution. Any topic that you are stuck on, that you want to study. There are so many good websites, so many good videos. Magoosh is just one of them. I think they do a really good job at summarizing the key points. There's so much more, but they do a good job at really highlighting, a lot of the main points. So this whole summary is from Magoosh. Feel free to pause the video right now and just kind of pick and choose, what do I want to write down? What do I think is the most important? These are obviously all the main factors as to why the colonists are going to seek independence. So maybe you want to just write down what's in bold. Maybe you want to write down the whole thing because you want to make sure that you understand this topic. You do you, okay? This slide is a review. We went over this in class, and hopefully you have asked me questions if any of these terms are unfamiliar to you. But take this as a moment. I know this is cheesy, but pause the video right here and ask yourself, do I know these terms? AP US History, you have to be a good writer, which we're working on. But you also have to know your history. You have to know your stuff. So again, test yourself. Go 1 through 11 and try to see if you know each one of these terms. It'll only take 5 minutes, but pause the video. Do I know each one of these terms? Again, I hope you did that. I hope you paused the video. If not, you just heard me sniffle. I'm still kind of sick, but again, these terms are all things that are super important to understanding the American Revolution. You guys know that the French and Indian War is a huge turning point. A lot of things happened between the colonists and England. And ultimately, also England went into debt, which caused a lot of these other taxes that you should memorize. The Sugar Act, being the first one, actually wasn't a huge deal, but it does signify the beginning of England asserting their control. The Stamp Act, we will go into class, we'll discuss this more in class, because this tax is actually not that big of a tax, but different patriots and different colonists are going to use this Stamp Act to rile up the people. So you'll see that. This phrase, hopefully you have memorized, that you know that this is kind of their rally cry. This is their slogan. This is the thing they're most upset about. The fact that England is taxing them without their voice, without their consent. The colonists don't get a vote in Parliament. So they feel like England's not really acting like a monarchy. They feel like England is kind of acting like a dictator, someone who just makes decisions for you without listening to your input. Now, England did respond with something called virtual representation. They said, hey, before you get too crazy, we are thinking about you. We have representatives that are speaking on your behalf, and they are voting for you. It may not be physical representation. It may not be direct representation, but England calls it virtual, meaning like, hey, we're thinking about you. Don't get too crazy. But speaking of crazy, we have this very big, awesome revolutionary group called the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. These people, in my opinion, are awesome. They are doing the risky things that maybe not everybody would do. The men are organizing these protests and these riots. The men are participating in things like the Boston Tea Party. They're writing pamphlets. They are, in the streets chanting every day, trying to spread the cause of a revolution. The women, who used to be overlooked in history, are doing so much as well for the cause of freedom. They are making their own clothes so that they don't have to buy them from England. They're making their own tea so that they don't have to buy them from England. They are doing so many revolutionary things behind the scenes in order for the cause to continue. So again, adding to the American Revolution. The Townshend Acts, more taxes on things like glass and lead and even tea. The Boston Massacre, which we'll talk a lot more in class, but is a physical, violent confrontation between the colonists and the British Army. You know from class that the colonists may have egged the British Army on, but regardless, the British Army did open fire and ended up killing some people. But the Boston Massacre is so much more than that little moment. It caused uproar. It caused people to wake up to the fact that, oh my gosh, this could get violent. This could get more serious than just taxes. So it increased the intensity of the American Revolution. And speaking of increase of intensity, the Boston Tea Party was a very rebellious act. It made England incredibly mad, which is why they, of course, did the coercive acts. This one, if in my personal opinion, is what probably made the colonists the most angry, because these are really intense laws. Shutting down Boston's harbor, that's going to really hurt Boston economically. Making them pay certain fines for the tea that was lost, adjusting their government without their consent. Like the coercive acts are truly intolerable, meaning you can't tolerate them. England really slammed their fists down and is trying to punish the colonies for their rebellion. And last but not least, the last two things, Samuel Adams, the leader of this revolutionary group, really kind of pushing forth the idea that we need to be an independent country. And lastly, these little informal town meetings. This is how they kind of spread their revolutionary ideas, was through the committees of correspondence. Correspondence means like communication, and a committee is a group. So these are just basically little town meetings that are talking about the revolution. So all of these, you should be able to talk through them. You should be able to know them very well, because all these terms build on one another. Resentment is building. Anger is building. The colonists are getting more united in the cause of independence. So let's see how our story continues today. We're going to talk about the role of propaganda in class. So hopefully you are there in class when I talk about it. But this picture, the bloody massacre on King Street, or the Boston Massacre, was engraved by Paul Revere, who is a patriot, who is also a son and daughter of liberty. And this is not a live snapshot of the event. This is Paul Revere creating an image of the Boston Massacre, but doing it in a very strategic way. Again, we'll talk about it in class, but you see that this is an example of propaganda. It's drawn in a certain way for you to see certain people as evil and certain people as innocent. It's drawn in a certain way to bring up emotion. It's very biased. Paul Revere, with who he is and what he believed, he drew it in a certain way. So propaganda is a huge piece to the American Revolution. Propaganda can be shown in images like this. It can be shown in speeches. It can be shown in books and pamphlets. But the spreading of ideas that England is bad, that England is trying to take away our freedom, and that we should become our own country. All of those ideas will be spread through different propaganda. Another way the American Revolution will be spread is through, of course, rebellion, riots, and protests. Little riots would happen in different colonies. Little protests would happen in colonies. People would boycott certain things. Like if you remember, I told you that the Daughters of Liberty were doing something called homespun. They were making their own clothing because they wanted to boycott buying English clothing. Again, they were trying to make their own tea because they wanted to boycott buying English tea. So the American Revolution, sometimes it's violent, like the Revolutionary War is violent. But sometimes like protests and riots are just happening kind of in the background too. But there's this general wave of rebellion occurring in the colonies. I kind of already talked about this, but I wanted to make sure you know the difference between the Committees of Correspondence and the Continental Congress. They're different. So again, the Committees of Correspondence were happening in the early stages of the American Revolution. They were allowing the colonies to communicate with one another. They were spreading revolutionary actions. So in the town meetings, that's when you would find out about, hey, we're going to do the Boston Tea Party. Hey, we're going to do this protest. Hey, we're going to do that protest. It was just a way to kind of, I guess, spread information between the colonies during the Revolution. But there is a formal meeting that we're going to talk about today, and that is the First Continental Congress. So again, this is a very formal meeting. The Committees of Correspondence are informal, but this is formal. This is the first ever Continental Congress. You know what a continent is, so we're not getting everybody in America together. But it is the first time that we are inviting representatives from every colony to meet up in Philadelphia. They're meeting up in 1774, and every colony except for Georgia sends a representative. I'm not sure what Georgia was doing. Maybe they were eating some peaches, but everyone else sent a representative. Now, the first thing to address in this meeting was the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts, like I just said, are super, super strict, harsh laws. And they were really trying to punish Boston specifically, because that's where a lot of this revolutionary stuff was happening. So England was trying to punish Boston. But all the colonies came together to kind of show their solidarity with Boston. And they wanted to talk about, hey, what should we do in response to these acts? Again, their goal is to figure out what is our unified response to Britain? What should we do as all colonies? What should we do in response to England? Well, the first thing they did is they wrote down a piece of paper that basically said that they had rights, and it also said the things that they were upset about. So hear me correctly. In this first meeting, they are not talking about leaving England. That might surprise you because there's all these patriots and all these sons and daughters of liberty running around saying that they want to leave England. That is not the majority of people yet, okay? Again, that's not the majority of people. Most people want to stay with England and they want to work on some things. They don't want England to keep abusing them, but they don't want to fully separate from England either. So the first result of the First Continental Congress is that they wrote the Declaration of Colonial Rights and Grievances, saying, hey, England, we have certain rights that we believe we have, and these are some things that we don't like. A grievance is a complaint. So they did write down their complaints against England. Primarily, the Intolerable Acts was one of those complaints. Now, just in case, this is especially after the Boston Massacre, in this meeting, they also did talk about the fact that there are British forces that are in our colonies. For example, in Boston, there were 4,000 British Army men in a city of 15,000 people. So that's kind of daunting. That's almost like a third of the people there were British Army people, and that's kind of intimidating. So just in case, at this meeting, they set up colonial militias. So they did, per colony, they did set up the fact that we might have people called Minutemen, which are average men that have a gun that can be ready to fight in a minute. So if you know a skirmish or a battle is happening nearby and you get word of it, join the colonial militia and be ready in a minute to fight. Now, fighting did actually occur almost like a couple months later at Lexington and Concord. This is our first skirmish, our first battle between colonial militia and British militia. Keep in mind, a lot of the colonists still want to stay with England, but now we're starting to see this get heating up, right? The Revolutionary War, I guess, technically starts at this point, but it definitely heats up a lot more later. So we see our first glimpses of fighting. Because we see the glimpses of fighting, we gather up again. So 3 weeks after Lexington and Concord, the colonists gather again. So everyone sends representatives, everyone except for Georgia again, sends a representative, and they meet up in the Second Continental Congress. This is also meeting up in Philadelphia, and now we're in 1775. But guys, I find this really interesting. In this meeting, we have a divided people group. Almost half of the people at this point, they want independence now. Enough is enough. They've been abused by England too long. England is now continuing to use force against us, and they truly believe we should be our own country. But reconciliation is also what half the people want. So half the people want independence, half the people want reconciliation. They actually want to get back together with Great Britain. They want to stay with England. They want to fix the problems. They do not want to become their own country. So in the quiz that you're going to take after this video lecture, I actually want to ask you, why would people be on either side? Why do you think some people wanted independence? Why do you think some people wanted to stay with England? So again, you'll answer this question in the quiz after the video lecture, but I really want you to think about this. You know what the colonists have been through. You know their experiences. You know what England has done to them. Why do some want to break up? Why do some want to stay with England? Something huge happens at this meeting. So we write something called the Olive Branch Petition. Olive branch is a symbol of peace. So the colonists, they say to King George III, they say, "We want peace." And King George says, "Does it look like I care?" No. That is not a direct quote. Do not quote me on that. But this is the general idea of what's happening. We sent a letter to the king that was asking for peace. Look down here. On July 8th, 1775, the colonies made a final offer of peace to Britain, agreeing to be loyal to the British government if it addressed their grievances. If England took back or repealed the coercive acts and ended the taxation without representation policies. So, our olive branch petition, our peace petition, was asking the king to take back the coercive acts, to cancel them, and to stop taxing us without our representation. If the king did that, we were going to be loyal to England forever. It was rejected by Parliament. And in December 1775, England actually passed the American Prohibitory Act, which forbade any further trade with the colonies. So they not only denied our peace petition, but they also cut off all trade with us, which is going to hurt us a lot. England is the way we make money, and so by cutting us off that way, they're really trying to send us a message. Now, don't think that we are so innocent over here. We did write the olive branch petition, but the next day, before we even knew that England rejected it, Congress also did pass the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, which explained and justified the 13 colonies' decision to go to war. So, going back to the previous slide, we did want peace. But I think in the back of our mind, we knew that this wasn't going to occur. So we wanted to plan for worst case scenario. So we did pass the idea that we would go to war against England. We did pick a leader of our Continental Army, and that was the commander George Washington. He had led a bunch of other battles recently. He fought really well in the French and Indian War, and so we saw his leadership and made him commander of our new army. And then he was able to raise an army through conscription, which is another word of draft. So that means we kind of forced people to fight in our army. And these are even young men, ages 14 and above, are being kind of forced to fight in the Continental Army. As the revolution continues, we will write our famous breakup letter in 1776. Granted, we're already fighting the English, but we make it real clear that we are declaring our independence from them. And we will, of course, talk about this topic more, but this is when it occurs. And at the same time we declare our independence, we also have to set up some form of government, which is the Articles of Confederation, which, of course, we will go into more later as well. I've kind of already talked about this before, but again, the Enlightenment is going to be huge for the American Revolution. So keep in mind, make sure you know John Locke, make sure you know Thomas Paine's Common Sense. He truly believes that we should be our own country, that England is being, too much of a controlling monarchy, and that we would have a better society if we were on our own. All of these Enlightenment ideals will be, of course, shown in the Declaration of Independence, which will be written by Thomas Jefferson with the help of other people as well. You'll see very popular phrases like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We will talk about rights and natural rights, which are all Enlightenment ideas. And lastly, an assignment we're doing soon is going over the Declaration of Independence, but there's a lot of main parts there's three main parts of the Declaration of Independence. It starts off with a lot of Enlightenment ideals. It lists the crimes of the king, aka their grievances and their complaints. And lastly, the big underlined bold point is that this document technically declares that the colonies, the English colonies, are the United States of America, and we are now freely independent from England. So we will, of course, go over some of these concepts a lot more, but I hope you took good notes on the American Revolution. Again, any questions that you have, write them down, and we can talk about them either in class or through email, whichever you prefer. Okay, great job, guys.